see that?
Yeah, I do.
I think it's time, right? Testing. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. This is the Registration Protocols Extensions Working Group. Just to make sure that you're all in the correct room. My name is Antoine van Schuren, and I have Jim Galvin here next to me, who is your co-chair. And I'd like to start the meeting with some apologies from me. I have been not so active in the past months. That's due to health issues, but I'm completely back. But apologies if I have missed some of the conversations in the past months. I will try to catch up and hope you're doing fine. First of all, in every meeting, of course, is our note well. Everything you say and talk in the IETF is part of the IETF. Everybody has read this so far, and note really well that we are here to cooperate, which means that there's no fighting, nor here, nor in the corridors, nor on the mailing list, and please treat everybody with respect and everybody's opinions with respect. We have a code of conduct guideline, BCP 54. So if you have any problems with any of the other participants in the working group or anything that's going on, you can approach us as chairs, but there's also an ombudsman where you can file your complaint if you need any help that you think your chairs cannot handle. Then some agenda bashing. First of all, let's see. Let's do some welcome and introductions first. So we did note well the notes scribe. We have Rick Wilhelm, who gladly volunteered to take some minutes. As you know, we mainly do things by the recordings and by the transcript. But if there are any additional comments, Rick will take them. And then this is a new work session. As you know, since the previous meeting, we split up our meeting doing the technical presentations in one meeting and the updates of everything that's in our working group in a second meeting. The larger slot is for the technical presentation, so that's this slot, and we'll do the all the other items on the agenda that we will do tomorrow in tomorrow's sessions, because that's one shorter and only has administrative updates. So, first presentation up is Andy Newton. He's going to talk about some work that we already adopted, RDAP extensions, and he has a presentation for that, and I'll bring it up for you. So, Jasdip, the floor is yours. Do you want to do the... No, it's difficult to do the slides, right? Yeah, then I should plug it in, right?
You can do it. I don't.
Yeah, I'll do it.
I don't have button envy. Next slide, please. All right, so I'm talking about the RDAP extensions draft, which is a document intended to update how extensions are done in RDAP, and most of it is to codify things that are a little ambiguous in the current drafts or the current RFCs, or things that we have kind of done as a working group that, while harmless, maybe we shouldn't have done. So, so yeah, I think that describes it. So we basically, this is all about extensions. It's not really about the core RDAP protocol itself, and just trying to make some clarifications. So next slide. All right, so what does this draft do? So we're clarifying how RDAP extensions are specified. In certain cases, we've kind of done some things that are arguably against standard 95, but are ultimately harmless. So that's why none of the stuff has caused problems yet. But this draft tries to put this into a much more clearly defined area. Like, yeah, that maybe was either ambiguous or out of bounds for the standard, but ultimately it's fine. So we can continue doing this kind of stuff. Let's go ahead and codify that. There are some places where some of the RFCs are kind of vague as to how you do things, like how you create new object classes and so forth. And so we need some strengthening around how to prevent people from colliding when they do that in an extension. Part of this exercise was reviewing the current IANA registries and some of the things that got in there that maybe shouldn't have. So we are trying to, one of the recommendations in the draft is to give more guidelines to the designated experts and the reviewers, and also create a system where we have more reviewers to count on, where they can back each other up and do a little bit of QA. And then we also have some privacy and some security considerations around extensions, which are needed. So as to why we did this draft, although it hasn't been going on lately for this past year, previous to that, we had 2 years of arguing about extensions. And so hopefully, if this gets through, we will no longer have many email threads about extensions and what they mean. All right, next slide, please. All right, so this draft doesn't change anything in the core spec. Doesn't change the data models. It doesn't change the queries. It is completely doesn't change anything that would be incompatible with the current ecosystem. So we're not changing anything that currently is implemented, and that's purposeful. It's probably something that should actually be stated in the draft itself. I don't think it is, but we should probably actually make sure that's put into the draft. Next slide. Yeah. So again, we're fixing parts of the past. This working group has ratified certain extensions, and it's not just this working group. There are other extensions that have gotten into the extensions registry, which do things that can be argued are against the RFCs. But ultimately, what they did was fine. They're not actually causing problems. So we're trying to make sure that we're just going to codify that and make sure that it's good to go. Yeah. There was an alternate suggestion about how we handle the current violators, and this is my interpretation of what was said on the mailing list. It may not actually be the intent, but that was that we should disallow those types of, as opposed to allowing that type of extension, we should go ahead and disallow that, and then kind of grant amnesty to the extensions that actually made these violations. I personally am not in favor of doing that. I think we should just go ahead and allow these types of things to go forward since they're harmless. And I do think it raises questions if we say that, hey, there are some RFCs out there that kind of violate these standards, but we're going to let them go. That does raise some questions about what happens if we need to update those extensions, or and a better question is, if they're in violation, then shouldn't we go ahead and fix them? But fixing them will probably cause disruption. So next slide. And that is it for this deck. Any questions?
So we have Scott in the queue first, I think.
No,
Yes.
I did not add myself to the queue yet. You want me? Are you going to add me to the queue?
I'll go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, this is Jim Gould from VeriSign. Yeah, we met earlier today to discuss this draft, and I believe that we came to agreement related to looking at what we called extension styles and having the draft qualify those. So are you in agreement with that, Andy?
Yeah, we that was mentioned on the mailing list, and I didn't see anyone disagreeing with it. So I think it's a good thing to put in there.
Okay.
I was mostly trying to get at the things we had discussed, things that weren't clear. But yeah, so what James is talking about is he listed the different types of extensions, and there's I think section 1 in the draft basically tries to outline what the draft is doing, but his categorization is actually much better than what we have in the draft. So we're going to try to take that language and adopt it and put it in. And I think one of the other things we talked about this morning was actually closing off any other types of extensions. So that's probably something we have to take to the mailing list. But I think that's a good idea too.
Or to identify how you can define other extension styles.
Right.
Yeah.
Closing off, as in, if you want to do something else that's not in this list, you need to get an IETF. You need to talk to Ori. So.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you.
And Scott, go ahead.
Thank you, Scott Hollenbeck. I want to take, well, maybe not exception, that's too strong a word, but Andy, you noted that some of these non-compliant extensions are harmless. I'd like to note that harm could also be an indication of lack of implementation or operational experience with some of these things, because having written an RDAP server myself, I know that in order to allow some of these extensions to be properly processed by my server, I now have to go make changes to that code to recognize that, that an extension identifier, whatever it might be, may not necessarily have an underscore in it. Okay, so is that causing me harm? I don't know, but it's certainly causing me work. And the other thing that's worth noting, the draft as currently written notes that it updates certain RFCs that are part of Standard 95. This is not a standard itself yet. So how a proposed standard or something that in some ways contains informational or BCP guidance mixed with protocol updates, I think that's just something else that we're going to have to talk about a little bit. Not that I object to it, but Ori, I know that when you get to see this, this is likely a question that someone is bound to ask.
So I believe when we first started this draft a year and a half ago or something, we did think it was just going to be an informational, and we changed it to standards, to propose to standards track, because we realized we have to update the standard 95 stuff. And the reason we have to update that is not because we're changing anything in the queries of the data models. It's all because that's where those IANA registries are defined. So that's the whole reason we have to update that. Now, if Ori's giving me this weird look, so maybe we don't have to do that, and I'm fine with that as well. Go ahead.
So I'll only take 3 times my name before I'll come to the mic in this meeting.
Beetlejuice.
Ori Steele, responsible AD. I've not read the draft. If you're adding an entry to an existing IANA registry, you probably don't need to update. If you're changing the registration process for a registry, you're performing, changes that are going to impact every entry in that registry moving forward, then yeah, you're probably updating it. But again, not read the draft. Happy to take a look.
That it's more the latter, where we're giving more criteria for what the reviewers need to look at. So.
Yeah, it's Jim Gould from VeriSign. One thing that concerns me is the word of non-compliance. That word's kind of thrown out in this working group quite a bit. And I believe that it could be opinion on what is compliant and what is not. So before we go down the track of identifying non-compliance, we should come to consensus on what actually is non-compliance.
I agree with you, and I think one of the purposes of this draft, I hope one of the purposes of this draft is that those things that are ambiguous or like the bear identifiers, that we can actually say, no, that's fine. That is, no one can make that statement that that's non-compliant. That's one of the purposes of this document, is to stop that type of argument. So, all right, any other questions? Thank you.
If not, then thank you. And then we'll go up to the next list of presentations. And to stay on the same topic and the same subject, an RDAP extension for RPKI registration. Andy, is that you or JazzDip? Are you going to present? So it's JazzDip. I see him coming forward. Let me get your slides up. So JazzDip, please go ahead. I just want to remind everybody we didn't have any timing on all the presentations, but we have 2 hours, so that makes it 15 minutes for each. So Jim will keep an eye on that. Go ahead, Jesse.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. So this is a new work The topic is an RDAP extension for RPKI registration data. And this presentation is to help the group warm up on request for adoption. Next slide, please. So motivation. I'll give a brief introduction. Sorry, I can't get into all the details of this. This is more RAR side work. So resource public, RPKI, first what it stands for is Resource Public Key Infrastructure. Just to give an analogy, like you have Web PKI, this is something which is used for internet resources. And what's happening is it's increasingly becoming critical for internet routing security. And to the point, I think in some places it has crossed the threshold of where 50% of the resources are right now RPKI'd in terms of from cryptography angle. The next part of RPKI is it enables internet number resource holders, which are in registries for IP addresses and autonomous system numbers, to cryptically assert about their registered IP addresses and autonomous system numbers to prevent route hijacks and leaks. So there's a lot of stuff behind the scenes, what starts in the registry. Sorry, it's itself a full spec, plethora of RFCs to go through that. But at core, what you're trying to do is prevent route hijacks and leaks. This draft, as the next slide will show, we tried covering the major aspects of RPKI. But why we are doing it, those are the next two bullets. The idea here is that clearly we have current RPKI diagnostic tools, but having RPKI registration data available through RDAP, it could complement those tools when troubleshooting a route hijack or leak. And remember, Antoine, when we started the RAR search work, we didn't forget that when he was like, hey, guys, are you guys gonna look at this? So, well, we are keeping our promise on that front. So that's the first thing, that it can be a troubleshooting complement. The second important part is that beside troubleshooting, because you're talking cryptography side, generally in RPKI side, you deal with signed objects. But here, you'll be able to visualize the RPKI hierarchy in human-friendly way. And we have precedence of it in some tools like JDR and Cloudflare. But having this data accessible through an internet standard, I think will help, for lack of a better word, bloom that industry or that set of applications to create. So the motivation is troubleshooting and also human-friendly visualization of RPKI hierarchies for a pretty important space, which is internet routing security. Next slide, please. This is important. What it is not. So just to set the sort of expectations or separation of concerns, it is not, and in fact, I use the standard terms here, must not. This extension, RDAP extension, must not be used to directly influence internet routing. It's very clear. This is informational. That's what the purpose of directory services is. You should not be using this to configure your internet routes. And secondly, frankly, inherently RDAP, nor this extension, it has any necessary security properties or distribution mechanisms required to securely add, remove, or modify internet routes. And I stress the word securely, because this is about that. So point is, what RPKI inherently is good at, we should stick with that. This is complementary. And in that sense, we believe it'll be useful. Because in other words, you're democratizing this information because everybody is not a bit manipulation expert. But at the same time, because we know there are tools out there, this will help with that. Next slide, please. So the salient features. I didn't want to get into all the details which are in the draft, and so please encourage you to review that. But at core, we are introducing a new extension identifier, RPKI1. There are 3 new object classes. And I think, if I recall correctly, this is the first time we're introducing new object classes beside the base protocol, what we have done. So there are 3. One is for route origin authorization. This is RPKI side, where the IP address holder, registration holder, cryptographically asserts about what's called the origin autonomous system number, what it allows to advertise its prefixes. Second one is another thing in RPKI which is being worked on is called ASPA, Autonomous System Provider Authorization. This is where an autonomous system holder in the registry asserts about what's called the provider autonomous system numbers, or they're called the upstream providers. And again, it's a cryptographic assertion. And lastly, RPKI also has a concept of BGP sec router certificates. And at journal level, it's the X.509 resource certificate, which most of us should be familiar here with. And because at code, you're creating what's called the org level CAs, certification authorities. So this takes care of making that information also available. So there are three object classes we are starting with, but again, in the Pareto's law, this will cover quite a bit of the RPKI space in terms of usefulness in the RDAP ecosystem. Just to clarify, there are a couple of more profiles being written cryptographically on the RPKI side, but they are being talked about, and we just wanted to focus on the real, what's right now looking very promising. ROA is out of there, ASPA is starting to be implemented. certs, absolutely, they're out there already. And if they ever come, then, and this extension gets worked on further, that'll be a future work. And I can give you one profile called signed prefix list, which is very interesting, where in that case, the autonomous system number holder is basically telling cryptographically what IP addresses it routes through its autonomous system number. So that we are not including right now. And whenever that comes, RDAP has a sufficiently mature extension model to take care of that. Search results. So clearly there are 3 search results here. And as you can see, everything is from at least object classes and search results is prefixed with RPKI1. And but that said, I was having a discussion with Scott Hollenbeck in the morning. We were talking about that, and I did check. He's right. When it comes to path segments, we are using the parent-child methodology rather than prepending with an underscore. Well, we can talk about that, and I don't have a strong opinion about it, but the parent-child seem more natural. So yes, we have the lookup, search, and reverse search functionalities defined here, and that's the raison d'etre of RDAP. That can you nicely search things? That's the whole point of directory service, and I think we believe we have done a decent job on it. And finally, from troubleshooting angle, RDAP also affords you the ability to show relations with a relationship with IP network, autonomous system number, and entity object classes. So we leveraged all that nicely in this. So these are the salient features of RDAP RPKI. Next slide, please. So yeah, I think this is an introduction for the working group. The idea is that I think it'll help standardize RPKI registration data. And I want to stress the word registration, access through RDAP. That's what RDAP stands for. And secondly, just to help us, we have got input from some members of the RPKI community. Job Schneider, Tim Brisnell, I think Tim is in the room right now, a few others. But that said, at some point, this will also probably be talked about in another working group called SIDOROPS, if this goes forward. And that's it. And then last slide is essentially the draft where it is, and GitHub, the way of working where we are listing issues and tracking that. So yeah, so. But I clearly understand this is a new semantics we are bringing into the REGEXT working group. but there we are. Thanks.
Thank you, Jasdeep. We have some questions in the queue. Scott, you were first.
Sure. Thank you. Scott Hollenbeck here. I'm very much in favor of adopting this work. I think it's very useful. It's not something we've done before. There really is a use case here. However, and this is not directed at this draft, Jasdeep. We have a couple of people now who are going to be offering up requests for adoption. We don't have a lot of people in this group that seem to be spending a lot of time reviewing drafts and commenting on them. And we've got a number of drafts that are currently, being worked on. I'd really like to see us push some of those over the finish line before we take on a whole lot of more new work, right? So, before we maybe consider taking a look at anyone as an individual draft, can we take that as part of a larger question of what is our current workload look like? What can we do to finish off the to pick that low-hanging fruit, and then consider which of the new work requests that we would be willing to adopt?
Do you have a suggestion, Scott?
Well, I can think of two that I'm working on that I think are really close. The EPP delete BCP, which has now been moved to the publication requested state, and the EPP EAI draft, which is again really, really close, I think.
No, I agree, and I think one of the issues that you point out, right? We have the audience here is not too big. What I want to add to that is this draft also brings out new work that is more on the RER space. So we could really do with more help from people from the RERs to review these drafts, because they understand probably better what all the semantics are than the usual people in the room that are busy with domain registrations. Yeah. Oh, Jim has a suggestion.
So a quick suggestion on your comment, Scott, and it is really an important one because you're absolutely right about our workload of prioritizing. Can I suggest that we have the discussion of prioritizing our work at the meeting tomorrow as part of our administrative discussions? So let's focus today just on the technical questions. Multiple people are going to ask for adoption. That'll obviously all go to the mailing list, but let's have a priority discussion tomorrow in our administrative meeting if folks don't mind. Thanks.
Okay, and then James, go ahead.
Yeah, I second Scott's opinion on this, is the fact that it's important work. One technical nit, if you go back a couple slides where you had the names, yep, stop right there.
Sorry.
Nope, go back. Here you go. The object class for the X509, why isn't that not camel case right there?
Sorry. That's a good question. It could be camel cased.
Okay.
But clearly the reason,
reading the extension
Right.
draft, and it said to do it camel case.
right. So I think the interesting thing is, sorry, not to dive too much into the how we name object classes. Earlier, if you know, we only have one class with multiple word tokens, IP network, sorry. And this is the first example of where we have names which are sort of multiple word tokens. So yeah, I think we can clearly look into that. But the use of underscore is interesting here because that is being recommended, because otherwise, if you end up using these names in URIs, you have to URL encode things, whereas with underscores, it's safer. Andy, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's the reason why we chose underscore. But yeah, your point about that, clearly it can be resource cert.
Yeah, that's something I think that we need to come consensus on related to the naming.
Frankly, it'll be consistent with, if you notice, the search
Yeah, I
results.
was going to say that.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks.
yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Then Tim Bruinels.
Yes, Tim Ruizels, Rug NCC. I do quite a bit of work on RPKI. We had a talk earlier. First of all, I would be very interested to see this move forward. In terms of its usefulness, yeah, without going into too much detail for this group. Well, first of all, I think it should also involve a discussion with CyberOps when it does move forward. In terms of debugging, if you want to look at the validity of BGP routes and so forth, I think you would look at your RPKI validator and your router first. But I think where this shines is that dependent on who does this registration, if it's the CA, it telling you what they expect to exist out there. That might help with debugging if you see differences between validation and what they think should be there. Similarly, an actor could be a RPKI repository that thinks like this is what's supposed to be out there, and that might differ from what validators see or accept. And there, I think it may actually add quite a bit of value.
Thank you, Tim. And we can have a discussion after this meeting because I have some use cases for this as well. Rick, go ahead.
I'll be quick because I know the time is up. Rick Wilhelm, PIR, supportive of the work. I think it's very interesting. A couple of things to consider. A couple of things from the TLD space that have been useful, as you know, but just to highlight it, one is the referral model has been super powerful in the TLD space, whereas as you know, a registry can refer to a registrar or to another RDAP server to go find certain things out. And I don't know this space as deeply as you do, obviously, because this is what you do for $ day job. But it'd be interesting to see if that referral model can and should apply here in order to gain leverage from something that's a very powerful primitive built into RDAP. The second thing, something that's come in very powerfully in the TLD space, is the concept of a bootstrap file. A bootstrap is something that we have in IANA for GTLD registries that allows that's what makes lookup.icann.org work. Again, as you know, and because it's a place where you can go and find everything in Bootstrap and grab RDAP URLs for all of the RDAP server, allows a federated model, right? So I would and there's probably other things that Scott, now that I've said those two things, Scott is probably thinking of, and he's like, oh, you should think about it. So I would just encourage you to look at those things. Thank you.
Yeah, and actually a quick answer to that. Yes, starting backwards, Bootstrap, absolutely. RARs, we also use that. And that's a very powerful concept to point to which registry you should go to. And the second part was the referrals. Yes, we are thinking about referrals also. Tim, who's actually the author of another protocol called RRP, RPKI Repository Delta Protocol. So the idea was that, hey, if you're going to point to, if possible, to the URIs for that, RPKI uses two schemes, rsync and RDP. But the idea was that there's a certain model of how, and the draft talks about it, where I think web linking, which is our concept of like what you were talking about, referral between registry and registrar, something very similar will happen here. So which we don't have yet vis-a-vis the RDP scheme, but we will be considering it, I think.
Okay, thank you, Jasdeep. For me, just to get a sense of the room, is there anybody that would object to adopting this document? Apart from what Scott already mentioned, is the workload in our registry. If not, then let's
just a quick comment. If you're going to poll the room for feelings, use the tool to support the remote participants as well. Thanks.
Well, I guess I was the one who was trying to motivate that with Antoine. It wasn't about polling the room. It was about giving someone a voice and explicitly asking for that voice. If you wanted to object and you had a reason, it'd be good for you to come up and say something. We'll do that for each of these presentations because multiple of them will be asking for adoption.
Okay, then next presentation is again an RDAP extensions. Gavin Brown about RDAP, the RDAP TTL extension. I put up the slides. Go ahead, Gavin. Take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, so this is another RDAP extension. We can move on to the next slide. So what it is a way to provide information about TTL values that might be published by a registry for delegations in that registry's zone. And also a way for information about the policies that apply to those TTL values to be discovered by outside world. Some of you may be familiar with the EPP extension for TTLs, which is very, very close to becoming an RFC soon. This is complementary to that, but it is not dependent on that, because it's perfectly possible for a registry that doesn't implement that draft, or doesn't implement that extension, to also be interested in publishing this information. And so it'd be possible for them to implement the RDAP extension, but not the EPP extension. So this is complementary, but not dependent. Next slide. So this is to give you an example of what that would look like when it was embedded in an RDAP response. So there's maybe a question to ask about the name of the property inside the domain object, but I haven't been following that close enough to be able to say that what we've got there is going to stay the same. But basically, what you have is an array of objects. And inside each of one of those objects, there's a value, which tells you what the TTL value is, and then an array of DNS record types. So you can then map particular DNS record type to TTL value. So by grouping them all together, basically, you're creating a more terse response. And then each one of those objects can also have events and remarks. These are standard RDAP objects, so that the consumer of this response can see what happened and when, and see what policies may be applicable. On to the next slide. So, why do this? Firstly, to say we already publish other information about delegations in RDAP. So we publish a list of name servers, we publish the DS records, and we publish glue records as well. So this is just kind of parity. Do you think about what gets published in the DNS for a delegation? We obviously publish the left-hand side of the record, and we publish the right-hand side of the record. We don't publish the TTL for reasons. And this is just kind of closing the loop on that. It's useful for debugging and monitoring, just as with the RPKR draft. These are things that network operators, administrators, sysadmins, nerds, whatever, are going to be interested in, to help them find out why something is the way it is or isn't the way it should be. But also to allow DNS operators to identify what policies might be applicable to the TTL values. And this is kind of something that came up during the kind of final late stage reviews of the EPP TTL extension, where it was pointed out, if I'm operating a very important domain name and I want to change the TTL values, I don't want to be surprised if suddenly they're changed without me knowing, because the registry implemented has a policy that I didn't know about. So I'm a customer of a registrar, so I won't necessarily have a direct relationship with the registry. So the only way for me to find this out would be somehow for me to I can either find the right website and go scanning through their policy page, or if it's actually there front and center in the RDAP response, here is where you go to find out what happens when you set your TTL to be something unusual or exceptional, how long you might expect it to stay that way before we change it, and that kind of thing. So it kind of fulfills a clear use there. Next slide. So I've already brought this kind of off casually to the working group a year or so ago. I have fixed bandwidth, so I operate a 1 in, 1 out rule. So once the EPP extension is out, then I'll have time to concentrate on this, and I'll bring it to the working group for adoption. In the meantime, it's being maintained in GitHub. So the GitHub repository does have a few things that aren't in 0.0. So 0.1 will kind of close the gap on that. But obviously, if anyone has any suggestions, wants to contribute, then that's where you go to fork the repository. Thank you. Next slide. Any questions?
James, you're first in the queue.
Yeah, this is Jim Gold from VeriSign. I'm going to mirror what I said on the list, that I have concern of including additional information in RDAP that is publicly available in DNS, so you can see what the TTL values are, and replicating the functionality that's in EPP within RDAP as well. I see the policy element or aspect of that, but that was really meant to help the registrars in setting these values. So making it available to the general public is an interesting concept, but I question like the added complexity, because in the end, it will be easier to do in the registry than it certainly would be to put policy kinds of functionality in an RDAP server and then replicate that out to the server. So I do have a concern related to inclusion of this data that's already available. And so I know that it's mirroring what has been done, but I kind of question some of those that are included in RDAP. I'm not sure whether or not the name servers, that's also in DNS, don't know. But it's an interesting pattern that we need to think about. So,
Yeah, thank you. Scott, you're up next.
Thank you, Scott Hollenbeck. Gavin, I apologize. Modulo what I said earlier about workloads, I have not read this draft. But the immediate reaction I got while listening to you talk was that when you're talking about TTLs, you may get different answers for what those values are depending on who you are asking. An RDAP server may return different information than a recursive resolver, which may yet return different information than an authoritative name server, right? I mean, caches being what they are in the DNS context. Does the draft include any text that addresses the fact that you might get different answers depending on who you're talking to and thus how those responses should be interpreted?
I think that would be sort of guidance for the end user. And potentially we could put some text in the draft that says, you might want to put a remark in or a notice in to say, hey, just be warned, this is only the TTL as it's published by the authority server rather than what you might see from a recursive. I don't know if there's anything that this draft would need to instruct an implementer to do other than offer that advice. But that's a good point. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Martin, you're up next.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Martin Woelink. I'm just wondering that TTL is usually not kept in the registry database, right? It's kind of more operational DNS layer. And if you want to put TTL in the RDAP response, you need somehow to synchronize the values that you're using in DNS with the stuff that's in your registration database, or at least your RDAP output. And that may lead to some fragility in a system where you need to keep those in sync. Otherwise, you end up with the risk of returning bad responses to TTLs that might have been changed in the DNS layer that may be handled by another team that doesn't tell the registration people or the RDAP people, hey, we changed the TTLs on our DNS. So I don't know if you thought about that.
I think it's a general issue. I mean, you could imagine all kinds of other data elements that are currently shown in RDAP where you've got different teams responsible for different parts of the response. If you are a registry that implements the EPP extension, then you have to solve those problems anyway, because you're going to be basically making that number, which is currently hard coded in a shell script somewhere. You're going to turn that into a field in your database because you're going to be allowing registrars or anyone with access to your registry system who's allowed to make changes to domains and name servers, you're going to be allowing them to change that number. So that obviously implies a lot of other changes behind the scenes, and so a lot of what you just discussed is work that's going to get done anyway if you're implementing the EPP extension. If you're not implementing the EPP extension, but you do want to implement this, then I would imagine that the business case has to be sufficient to actually do what you've described and make sure that you've got proper alignment with inside your organization to make sure that what that number gets hard coded into your RDAP server matches the some way of synchronizing, or it comes from a config option or something. But that to me feels like a implementation issue rather than the protocol issue.
Oh, okay, so I see it's like the counterpart of the EPP extension where you allow for a domain name to have a separate TTL value.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay. Now I understand it better. Thanks.
Next up is Rick.
Real quick, Rick Wilhelm, PIR. This is interesting. I'm going to echo a little bit of what Scott said, I think. I'd be concerned about putting a number in RDAP that could cause end user or whoever is observer, I'll just call observer confusion, because the TTL that is operationally experienced, and like those of us who hang out a little bit in DNSOP know that TTL may or may not be respected. That's a whole completely different kettle of fish. But even so, the TTL that the end user sees, whether or not it's respected, could be a completely different TTL than the registry is publishing. And that TTL is also, there's different update cycles on the DNS and things like that. And so I'd be concerned about giving out a number at the RDAP than is different than is experienced. And so that's why I'm a little bit ambivalent about that. So I haven't decided one way or the other, but like it's a little queasy in my stomach. So thank you.
I think that's a valid point. I mean, there are, like I say, that like name servers are another thing, the way you can have a difference between what's published in the DNS and what's published in the directory service. I think the TTL has this added thing that sometimes you get recursive servers that ignore it anyway, and obviously it will start counting down as well once they're answering from cache. So I think it goes back to the idea that maybe a server that's offering this information in its responses needs to provide some guidance through a remark or a notice or a link or something that says, this is what the recursive server sees from the authoritative server. This may not be what you see when you're typing dig into your command line at home on your DSL.
Okay, thank you. Jim, you're next.
Jim Reed, speaking for myself. I kind of like this idea, but also share some of the queasiness that Rick had just mentioned before. But I think you've kind of hinted at the potential solution here already, Gavin, is that we have to be clear about what this number means and have some indications of what the expectations would be for the observer, whoever that may be, when they're retrieving that information. Is it registry policy? Is this what you can expect to see inside an authoritative response from some authoritative name server? Or is it something that's going to be lurking around in a cache somewhere in, say, a resolving server? So some clarification about what this number actually means in practice, I think would be very, very helpful. But the general principle, I think, is fine.
Yeah. Thank you.
Just as a reminder, you see that we closed the queue because we have quite a cool clone queue already. So yeah, Andy, you're up next.
Oh, okay. So I got confused in some of this conversation. The number that you want to put in RDAP is what is being told to the registry to put into DNS.
Yeah.
It is not what is in DNS, correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting distinction, and that goes back to what Jim just said. If maybe even put in the draft, like here's a suggested remark to put in saying, hey, by the way. But no, I think this is a great idea, especially if anyone's ever had to deal with a registrar that accepts a TTL value and then doesn't honor it. Knowing what the registry was told is very useful.
Yeah.
So.
And I think, one of the things that the EPP extension does is it enables a whole bunch of operational processes that don't exist now. And so people are going to want to have transparency because, one of the reasons why the EPP extension got revived, because I wrote it like 15 years ago. One of the reasons it got revived is someone came to me and said, "Oh, were you at the IETF meeting in wherever it was?" Big interest in large operators saying, we would turn DNSSEC on our top, single digit domain if we could have an easy rollback plan. So we can, shorten the TTL, add a DS record, and then start, and know that if we screwed it up, that we can roll it back without having to wait for the 2-day TTL on our .com to expire. So recognizing that there's that need for the ability to do that, you don't want to kind of, make that available as a mechanism without being very transparent on what the processes are for how that value gets published into the DNS, how frequently it gets updated, whether the registry might decide, given information that we have about operations, we might want to unilaterally change it for you because you've set the TTL that's too low and we're getting too many queries, so we're going to operationally going to say we're going to reinstate the previous TTL to get things back to normal. Those are, and the EPP extension does have a mechanism for messaging that, so it uses the EPP message queue for that. But if you're just a DNS operator who's talking to their client and saying, please can you copy and paste this into your registrar's web form, you're very much at a remove from that whole process. By making information, putting it into RDAP, at least they have some visibility on what's happening, and that's, I think, a really important thing, considering what might happen if the EPP extension becomes widely adopted, or adopted at least in certain, very big places.
Last one, Pavel.
All right, Pavel Koalik, Danik. I haven't read the draft, so sorry if this is already in the draft, but I'll ask it anyway. So you say that's corresponding to the EPP extension. So does this draft expect that every domain would be responded with the TTL, or only those which will have a customized TTL, let's say, compared to the default?
It doesn't say anything about that at the moment. It's something to think about. I think if you're an RDAP client implementer, you kind of like it to be there for everything, because you don't know if you're trying to present that to the user, or present it or process it in some way. You don't know what to do if it's not there. All you can do is say, I don't know, because with absence of a way of discovering what the default value is, which would probably require a DNS query or something, it's not going to be able to do anything. So my personal thinking is, with an RDAP implementer's hat on, is I'd want to see it there for every domain. But as a draft author, I'm not saying I want to force everyone to do that.
Okay, thank
Thanks.
you, Gavin. That was it. And this leaves us from the track of the RDAP extensions. And let's go to some more implementation guidance. And next one up is James Gould about his implementation experience on EPP over HTTPS and Quick. James, floor is yours.
Thanks. Yeah, can you go to the next slide? Yeah, so we've presented on these two drafts a couple of times here. Just in review, the EPP over HTTPS, or EOH, is an internet draft. Pretty much what it how it's defined is that an EPP connection, which we call an EOH connection, is mapped to an HTTP session. And what happens is that a client will connect to the server, which will then return back the EPP greeting and establish the HTTP session. From that point on, the client will send an HTTP post to post the packets. So that's all it's doing. It's just pushing packets from the client to the server and getting the response. The goal here is to provide a more cloud-friendly transport for EPP. So if you're a registry and you want to deploy to the public cloud, you don't have to build a custom EPP gateway. You can use one of the existing ones. The second, the EPP over Quick, the whole idea here is the fact that Quick connections establish the encryption. And then once the encryption is established, you can establish multiple streams. It happens that the logical equivalent of an EPP connection in Quick would be a stream, or a Quick stream. So what winds up happening here is that an EPP stream is created, which returns the EPP greeting. And then from that point on, it's, again, pushing content over the stream, just like it would do over a TLS connection. And the goal here is to provide for security and performance. So you can go to the next one. So if you're not familiar, there is an EPP SDK that VeriSign has created. I actually created it when I started at VeriSign a very long time ago. It consists of 35 EPP extensions. Now, these aren't just extensions implemented by the VeriSign registries. I will implement any one of the EPP extensions that come through this working group, like the TTL extension that we were just discussing. In this SDK includes many session pools. That particular functionality was a little bit of a challenge when it came to adding new transports. So that was kind of an interesting point. And the other thing is the fact that there is a stub server. So when the extensions are created in the SDK, I was able to get experience on the server side as well as the client side. You can go to the next slide. So my experience with EOH is, first off, we had implemented EOH many years ago. And when we did it, it required HTTP keep live. It was tied to the HTTP connections. But now with HTTP 2.0 and eventually 3.0, is that it needs to be tied to the HTTP session, not the connection. The The software that was used was Java 11 and above, has the HTTP client class, and also you use the embedded Tomcat server for the stub server. So the way it worked was the fact that you need to have the EOH connection mapped to the HTTP session, like I said earlier. But what I found was that I was able to reuse the code that was used to establish the TLS context for EOH. And the other thing was the fact that to establish the HTTP session, you need to actually configure the cookie manager in the HTTP client. The HTTP client class actually does have pluggability of the HTTP transport, which makes it configurable, which was really nice. And we did update the draft based on this experience, mainly around the content header and the other headers, the cache control and the expires. What I could not test was HTTP3. There was no implementation of HTTP3 with the HTTP client, and I believe that's because of the lack of implementation of the quick in Java. So you can go to the next one. So with EOQ, I had to find a Java quick library. The one that I found was Quick, Kwik. It has a client and server implementation. I would say it's not ready for prime time and production, but it was useful for prototyping. And really, that particular library has limited configurability. It didn't allow for getting the client certificate in the server. So hopefully they'll be able to get them to add that. And then the other thing is that I found out that in Quick, when you create a stream on the client side, it doesn't actually send a message to the server. So the server does not know that the client created a stream. It's lazily created when the first byte is written to the stream. So based on that, what we did was we created a EOQ connection start packet message to trigger the creation of the stream on the server side so the EPP greeting could come back. So it was kind of unnatural to do that, but that was the only choice that existed. Future things that we're looking to do is to be able to support multiple streams per connection. Right now it's one-to-one. I really want to test the performance between EPP over TLS and EPP over Quick. And then I'm looking to be able to retrieve the client certificate once the library supports it. So next. So in conclusion, I was able to implement these transports in the SDK and run all the tests successfully with 35 EPP extensions. It's completely pluggable, compliant with RFC 5730 as transports. We did learn a lot in the process and updated the drafts to reflect that. I'm encouraging you to do more review of these drafts. And I'm going to mirror everybody else that's been up here. We're going to be looking for working group adoption of these drafts. And that's it.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Any questions? We have Gavin in the queue.
Hey, Jim, thank you for bringing this work. This is really good. I have a couple of questions, maybe based on my ignorance rather than anything that you've said or not said. With the start packet thing you mentioned, is that just specific to I'm going to call it Kwik to distinguish it from Quick. Is that just that specific to Kwik the way it's implemented, or does the Quick protocol say you lazily create?
Yeah, when I saw that and I was running the code, I was like, why on earth does the server not see this? And I thought maybe it was I'm going to call it Quick. I'm not sure how you pronounced it, but then I looked at the RFC and I found it. I should have recorded it, but it really did reflect the fact that it's a lazy creation of the stream on the server side.
So it is actually a thing of the protocol.
It's a protocol. It's a protocol thing. So it's not something that we could get around with, because otherwise, I wouldn't have recommended adding this start packet to the draft if it was something specific with this library.
That was my next question. Does the EOQ draft need to reflect this then?
It does, yeah.
And the other question was, I don't know too much about Quick, but does the authentication, so obviously you're doing client TLS client authentication when the connection's established, then you're doing login kind of potentially quite a long time afterwards, because you're sending an EPP login command. And if you've got, let's say you've got a long-lived quick connection with many streams, each of which is separately authenticated, is there an issue there where you might have, you might do a client authentication and then not do a login for a very long time afterwards?
It's a good question. So the way that we equate it is that a quick stream is like an EPP connection.
Mm-hmm.
So the keep alive would be done on the stream and not on the quick connection. And in the implementation, you don't get a really good handle on the quick connection itself. On the server side, it's somewhat hidden from you.
Mm-hmm.
And so what's important, and I was wondering if I was able to get the client certificate, which would I be able to get it from the stream or the connection, and how do I go about getting it? But pretty much the keep alive would be at a per stream basis.
Yeah.
And so if a client didn't do the keep alive and there was a time on the server side, it would close the EOQ connection, which would close the stream.
Right.
And then if all the streams were closed down, then the quick connection should get closed.
Okay.
But there is an inherent issue, is the fact that if a client were to close the quick connection, it would wind up closing all the streams, which are logical, like EPP connections.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Makes sense.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, and I see nobody in the queue anymore. So thank you, Jim, for staying in time.
Objections real quick.
Hmm?
Ask about objections real quick.
Yeah. So again, the same as the previous presentations. If anybody has objections to adoption of this document, this is your chance to get into queue. Yeah, but we don't want everybody in the room to stand behind in the queue, right? Okay, then yet another topic. We have a presentation on CodeSec from Victor Zhao. And you are online, right, Zhao?
He's there.
Yeah. Hi. And we can hear you a little bit. Say something again. Yeah, okay, it's working. Yep.
Okay.
You want me to I will do the slides for you, right?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so go ahead, Victor.
Hi, chairs and working group members. This is Victor. I'm very honored to be here. I'm new here, so bear with me if there any etiquette was not properly followed. And thank you, James, for helping me a lot. So today I'm trying to present AuthCodeSec, an idea basically extending EPP with public key authentication to make domain transfer safer, actually more important as a keyword, but also it could potentially be faster. And I see it's relevant to some of the previous proposed work as well. So next slide.
There you go.
So I'm going to briefly talk about the current mechanism of AuthCode as I understand it, and then why we want to upgrade and previous work that I see people following in the email list, and some backward compatibility and roadmap to an incremental update and design discussions for the group. Yeah, next. So I think I want to flag out that many of the people in the working group are probably super familiar with it, and we have Scott in the audience. So, but to my understanding, please clarify if I were wrong. The shared password is basically issued by the losing registrar as a shared password, and there were a few efforts to make it safer, such as the 9154 trying to hash it to reduce the chance of it being attacked or leaked. But I will address that. But basically, to make it make that shared password across all 5 parties is a very high requirement for the security model assumptions. So next one. The why is basically it's too wide of an attack assumption, attack surface, rely on authenticity, secrecy, and availability in almost every segment of the communications between the 5 parties. And if you involved resellers, sometimes that's 7 parties to assume. It also is requiring time update and the secrecy in storage. It's also vulnerable to insider attack and conflict of interest. Sometimes some parties are just not incentivized to kind of make this process quicker or safer. And also, I think one of the big thing we want to improve from the current model is to also specify who's being transferred to, and the shared password, or from my understanding, the current the hash model doesn't specify who the tower is being transferred, other than the trust model between registry and registrar or EPP client server. So being able to verify and specify and verify the transferee, I think it's going to be an improvement here. Next. A few previous efforts helped improve some of the security, and then that reflects a bit of the security model. And what I like to call the auth code XCC is similar to how DNSSEC helped DNS upgrade a backward compatibility, but adding public key authentications to improve to reduce the attack surface, and to specify the receiver to avoid double transferring, basically establish the trust chain between transfers. Next. So I think one of the key thing is what to be specified in this, what to be signed. And then here there's some proposal, basically including the versions so for future extensions and upgrades, none for any other replay prevention info, and then receiver, basically who will be the future approver. Is this the registrar or registrarian? And then the current approval information, if it makes public key identifier, public key authentication verifiable, and digest information. And then design question is when it comes to the signatures, does it go into the PW auth info or the extension of info? And that was actually a question I have for the group. And then I think we were kind of like to lean towards lean forwards to PW, but yeah. So next. Yeah, this is a model that we ideally want to propose. Basically, ultimately, we want to allow the registrar to sign it and then pass this all together to the registry, and then get it approved and verified. And then basically the losing registrar is just the one to be notified. But there's also several fallback considerations. Like today, if everyone have not adopted it, any new adopters could just submit the signature as a regular domain PW, and then the old workflow should just work. And then also when registrars have not massively adopted, registrar and registrars can adopt from their perspective, being the one that signs, and make it much secure. For example, the transferee at least is at the registrar level, so one cannot transfer a domain to 2 different registrars, or someone cannot claim that they're being transferred while they're not the same registrar. So this is a proposed model. And go next. And it's a little bit small chart. Basically, the model 1 is the ultimate goal. Model A is registrar and sign, and model B is when registrar and have not all adopted, registrar would sign on behalf of the registrants. And when everyone have not adopted or the registry have not adopted, the current model still works and works is the same. So next step. So as this is the first time this work is being proposed in a working group, love to ask the audience what was any concern of using the proposed domain TW for best backward compatibility versus using the domain extension EXT, and then what are other things we want to include in the digest, how to make it extendable, and then I think the last one is more of a non-technical. Maybe that's a better forum for the ICANN to answer. But from a technical design perspective, we need to also include how to enforce the rejections. So this is a high-level first step for discussing this work. And I know there's a lot of part that's left out. But yeah, love to hear the feedback, early feedback from the audience. Next one. Yeah, thank you. Sorry for the very rushed deck preparation.
That's okay, Victor. We have a number of questions in the queue for you. And Andy, you're first. Go ahead.
Thank you. I like the general idea of thinking about how to use public key cryptography to solve this problem. So I kind of like the general path. And I thought I had read the draft, maybe I hadn't. But the one of your slides, you had a bunch of properties there, and my question there was: are we reinventing certificates just for this? Or is there some? I mean, what I don't think we should do is get into reinventing other public key cryptography mechanisms that we could just steal. That's really
right. Yeah, thanks, Andy. There's no reinvention of the public key cryptography is being there's nothing that's being invented here. We'll be using the existing public key cryptography. We'll be using the public key the hashing and the standard approach to digest to hash and digest that. So it's more about what content to be signed. The question is about to what extent what content should be signed. And for example, I was proposing that we should include the receiver, which should be identified as their public key identifier. And so that's like a big advancement from not having it in a digest and not having it being signed. But yeah, no new algorithms is being proposed.
Yeah, well, that wasn't my point. I really hope we're not going to invent algorithms in this working group. My point was there are things like X509 certificates and that kind of stuff, and that's what I think that if we could reuse that as opposed to inventing something new would be good.
Right. Yeah, the intention.
I'm not saying necessarily X509 certificates, but those types of things, those container objects and stuff like that.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. Yes, the idea is that we will be using existing one, including X509 certificate to other certificate mechanisms that already exist. And I should probably make it more clear. Yeah, but thank you for flagging, for raising that. Yes.
Go ahead, Pavel.
Pavel Kolik, Denik. I have a question, especially in scenario 1 or A. You mentioned that the registrant would sign this object, and how would you deal with the keys management? So how would the registry know the public key of the registrant?
Okay. I don't know if I throw this word into the group, it would cause a lot of worries and concerns. But while most of the time people manage their public keys right now in their using their operating systems. The new paradigms of usage is that people are managing their keys in their applications and client. Okay, let me do this. In the new paradigm of blockchain usage, people are assumed to manage their own keys in their own wallets applications. And I didn't mean to say that this has to work for the blockchain usage, but we have seen that increasing group of people have been managing keys themselves. And of course, servers has been managing their keys, which is what the model B that registrars can sign them for quite some time. So yeah, but thank you for asking that. Yes, the ultimate goal that registrant will be signing it or endorsed by signatures from the registrars could be a way. But maybe within the 5 years or this decade, we can't assume a significant amount of people will actually sign it themselves. So we will see a roadmap from Model A to Model B, from Model B ultimately to Model A, which is registrar sign.
So basically, we are saying that we assume that the registries will know the kind of digital identity of the registrant and very public keys.
Yeah, and that's why I felt this is also relevant to the previous the public key infrastructure as well. And I happen to see that DNS has a good opportunity to serve that purpose, identifying individuals as well as their public keys.
Okay, thank you. Jim, you're next. And we have to hurry up a little bit, so if you can keep it short.
Sure. Jim Gould from VeriSign. The first question related about use of domain X versus domain PW. I believe domain X would be appropriate here, since this is a completely new way of authorization info. I don't think you'd want to like mix the two. So I'm assuming that this would be base 64 encoded, and a registry would have to determine it based on language, I assume. Is that correct?
That's undecided yet, and I think the base 64 encoded is one of actually in the doc, it's one of the proposed possibility. Yeah.
Okay, and then on this Model B, I would say Model A or B. I'd say B, because Scott Hollenbeck would probably tell you that the auth info was originally meant to be set by the registrant, but I don't believe it ever has been. So I would recommend Model B. And lastly, related to digital signing, we have two EPP extensions that we have worked on in this working group. The first being the launch phase in RFC 8334. The other was a verification code extension that used XML signature as the basis for signing. So you may want to take a look at those. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And also like to thank James for the help from the email list as well. Hi, Scott.
Hi, Scott Hollenbeck here. Just a thought. The friction that currently exists in EPP around this process, it's important to understand that it's there by design. Because very early on, there were concerns that if we made the transfer process too easy, we'd be having to deal with cases of domain slamming. This is a concern in which unauthorized people would be requesting transfers, and the quote unquote losing registrar would have no ability to say, no, we're not going to let this happen, for reasons that might be either technical, they might be, cost related or whatever. Anyway, I say this because I think that whatever you want to do with this, the losing registrar still has to have the ability to basically say, no, I'm not going to authorize this. So please keep that in mind.
I see. Thank you. I'll look forward to deeper discussion and learning about that rationale.
Rick, go ahead.
Rick Wilhelm, PIR. A couple things. One important thing to consider is that earlier there's a comment that it should be somehow signed so that only a certain gaining registrar could get access to it. often the registrant, typically the registrant doesn't want the losing registrar to know who the gaining registrar is going to be when they're requesting a transfer. So operationally, that's something important to consider. Secondly, not sure how much folks are aware, but in the ICANN world, the transfer process is in the process of changing, no pun intended. Auth codes are changing to be ephemeral. Up to now that is very short-lived and with a default state of null. And so heretofore, auth codes have been able to be set when the domain gets created. And as folks know, be able to sit around and maybe be discoverable, maybe be scribbled down on a piece of paper, maybe set away an email, all the things that Victor's been talking about. But with the new transfer policy that's coming down the road, and not in a matter of weeks, this is going to take a while, but coming relatively soon, auth codes are going to be ephemeral in that the default state of the auth code is going to be null. And it's only when you go to your registrar and say, I want to transfer the name, is then the auth code going to be set. And so the risks of auth code hijacking or stealing or something like that are going to be narrowed by orders of magnitude compared to what we're dealing with now. And even right now, there's enough friction, as Scott pointed out, in the process to prevent these kinds of things. So I'm not sure if the juice is worth the squeeze on this thing. Thank you.
Yeah, I like to respond. Thanks, Rick. I like to respond. One of the important use cases is actually domain transfer in the context of a sale. And in a sale, a lot of times people have to find their medium to pass on the auth code. And regardless of how safe we make it within the transfer registrar registry content, when the medium is opened up for the sale, the medium is like uncontrollable. And so that makes shared password very hard to maintain the security, but also hard to audit, right? You basically don't know who is in the part that leads the problem. And regardless of how short it is. And public key authentication is a big advancement that has shown the previous model has a very high requirement for the security assumptions.
Okay, thank you, Victor. Now we have one more question in the queue. Jody.
So I just wanted to echo what Scott and Rick both have said, a big +1 to both of them. We do need a little friction in the process to do the transfer due to the fact of domains being hijacked, et cetera. I mean, it was meant to be that way. The losing registrar needs to be able to deny the transfer away. Doing an instant transfer has been pushed back in the ICANN world many times. Also, the changes to the auth code that Rick was talking about should make everything much more secure. But I just wanted to say something about Model A and Model B. First of all, most registrants will not be able to do the cryptographic model at all. I mean, they don't understand keys. They barely understand their domains. This would be for companies that have a large IT department, or it would be for domainers that are very technically based or have a large number of domains and can hire somebody to do that for them. So I kind of agree with Rick that this juice may not be worth the squeeze. Also, another way, you've talked about the domain sale. There are models out there where the registrant doesn't even need to know what the auth code is. They basically trust a system to be able to sell the domain name and then transfer it to the owner when it's done. So there are models that have been brought up in the business world that actually work on being able to transfer these domain names without even the registrant just approving the transfer, saying, I will sell it for X number of dollars. When it hits that, go ahead and sell it. And I don't even need to know what the name of the password is, and it won't be given to the seller. The seller just winds up with a domain name in their account. So there are ways to get around that also. Just adding that. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Jody. Let me quickly respond to the first question. I think I didn't see it as a concern, but now that you flagged it, frame it seems like to be a concern about potentially the losing registrar need control. I'd like to clarify that in the Model B, it is the losing registrar that signs the authorization, not the gaining, of course, not the gaining one. So which means that the losing registrars is in the control in this model. And the model A is the losing registrant to be in the position of signing. And so therefore, of course, it's between them and the losing registrar to decide whether they want to add a control. And maybe an endorsement model can be placed when people still need that. And then second question is people, it is very hard to assume people will be able to manage their public key. I think we can also put in the context that the development of passkey approach and Touch ID, and you see all of these next generation authentications has been in place. And so I expect that as we advance, there will be more and more people that's able to manage their key with the help of the infrastructures like passkey, like the single sign-on that provides those that can help them sign other signatures once they log in. So that's for the other layer to help.
Okay, thank you, Victor. I don't think I need to ask, does anybody have rejections to adopting? If that was your question, Victor, because I think there were already enough people in the queue to express their opinions. I suggest we keep this discussion on the mailing list. And thank you, Victor, for presenting this. And we have to hurry because we ran a little bit over time already. So next one's up is my beautiful co-chair, Jim. And he's going to talk about domain variant support for EPP.
Okay, thank you. I should start by saying first that I stand in front of this mic as an individual contributor, just to be very clear about all of that, and that Antoine will be handling all chair responsibilities with respect to this work. The second thing by way of background is just in part a reminder. This work is motivated by some very significant work that's been going on in ICANN. There's very much a need in EPP to be able to support IDN variants. So that's the only question that's being asked here and being responded to here, is being able to support that. There's nothing in this draft that hasn't been exposed before. I mean, we had a discussion back in May in a joint meeting between some ICANN folks and a REGEXT meeting. I also briefly introduced this work during the REGEXT meeting at IETF 20 at our last meeting. Many, many thanks. I have to acknowledge Arndt here, who has put a good deal of work, really all the work in putting this down in words and preparing the draft for me. But this work has seen a lot of socialization among registries and registrars on the GTLD side in ICANN. While this work has been under development for multiple years in ICANN, the policy recommendations, there's been a small group of us on the technical side that have put a lot of effort into this particular architectural model. So this is just putting down in words. I'm going to review it again here real quick. And in the end, as others have done, the point here is to ask for adoption, and then we'll have to dig into the details of what all of this looks like. So next slide, please. As a reminder, this is just the agenda. I'm going to talk about some principles that got us going. I want to call out definitions that are in the document because it's useful to identify a couple of things in particular that change in our domain name system registration ecosystem. I want to add some words to our vernacular here. And then I've divided up the set of, in the document, all of the EPP transforms. There's a statement there about what has to change or not change. And so there's just 3 slides if you've looked at them in advance, and I sort of categorize the set of changes into none for some transforms, minor, and then there's really one significant change that would have to happen, and just calling that out for us. So next slide. an important part of the architectural principles. The first one is kind of absolute, and we believe we've honored and respected that in what's being brought forward here. So backwards compatibility is a requirement. Even in the ICANN world, supporting variants is optional. So it really was important that whatever solution we provide, it work if you support it, and if you don't support it, everything still works. Even if you try to, register and create a variant, the system will do the right thing if you happen not to support variants. And that was kind of important here. The fundamental change in supporting variants, this is the thing to get to know. Right now, our provisioning system is very transactional on a per domain basis, on a per label basis. What variants bring to the table is that you're now dealing with a set of names. And that really is the change. And that's a fundamental change in the way things work in the ecosystem between a registry and a registrar. And so that's what we have to accommodate, is figure out how to manage that. So next slide, please. There are some guiding technical principles. These are also driven and motivated by what the policy is trying to achieve. So, based on that, we sort of put together these kind of technical requirements. It occurs to me I should probably also say that the prior slide and this one, these words don't appear in the document yet. Seems to me they probably ought to appear. I've had these slides at multiple times in multiple presentations, and it seems reasonable to put this in an introduction or something in the document itself at some point here. But important thing is that there's this notion of a primary label, and it defines the set. So a variant set comes into existence as the result of a primary label that is identified. And then that is used with the label generation rules to identify everything else in the set. And that's important. The life cycles of all members of the set match the primary. And what that really means is they go away when the primary goes away, but otherwise they're allowed to have their own life cycle. So really the end point of the life cycle matches the primary. Okay. Also, the primary has to be created first. So it has to be created first, then you can manage all of your variants in their own life cycle any way that you want. But when the primary goes away, all the variants go away too. So that's an important change in all of that. Variant sets can operate inside a set of variant TLDs, which just makes things a little more interesting. If you're going to, as a registry operator, if you're going to support variant TLDs, you get into interesting complications. I'm not going to spend a lot of time focusing on that here, but there are some guidelines in the policy recommendations, and this particular technical solution allows all of those things to continue. And then the last bullet is really just more of an observation for us as we think about what we're doing here. There are at least conceptually now 3 statuses for a given label. We're used to this notion of 2 statuses. It either exists or it doesn't, right? So it's either registered or it's not. But now you have this notion of registered, eligible to be registered, okay, or even blocked, which means you can't even register it and can't use it. So it's just useful to sort of keep those concepts in mind. Just adds a little bit of something when you're dealing with variants. So next slide, please. Definitions. I already talked about primary label. A variant set is defined by the first label that's created, and that's just an IDN, characteristic, if you will. That's just something that comes out of the internationalization requirements. When you're dealing with multiple variant GTLDs, right, then there is this notion of a source label. So the source label is the first primary label, and each GTLD will have its own primary label. I'm not really going to dig into a lot of that here, but just an observation that that's a different. There's also a notion of a variant label. So if you're a member of the set, you're the variant label if you're not the primary. Just a useful way to distinguish them and be aware of them when you're working. Allocatable versus allocated. The name is, once the primary is created, then you don't register variants, you allocate it, which causes it to come into existence. The registration of the primary makes all the variants allocatable. So that's just a kind of a reservation state, if you will. There's a term called grandfathered because obviously there are IDN names that exist out there. This document currently uses the word grandfathered, but the IDN document and the policy statement on the ICANN side is moving away from saying grandfathered and using the word exempt instead, all right, to get to a more gender neutral term, if you will. So we'll be migrating our document here to align with that, just so that things are very clear. I've already mentioned blocked. There are various security and stability reasons why certain labels in a variant set need to be blocked. So the LGR rules might allow a label to be created and identified, but whether or not it can be registered is a different question. Whether or not it can be allocated is a different question. And then normal is kind of the state that we have now. Next slide, please. Two transforms, that don't have any changes are renew and transfer. The transfer query doesn't have any changes with it. The transfer command, obviously, will have changes. Next slide, please. In part because you're now dealing with a set of labels. A transfer of a label implies a transfer of all labels in the variant set. That's one of the issues about dealing with a set as opposed to an individual name. Check has 3 new error messages. Info has an optional extension so that you have to, if somebody does an info command, you need to be able to tell them that you've asked about a variant and it's part of a set. And you tell them which set it's part of by giving them back the primary label in the extension. So that's just extra information that's added. And delete has no change to the query, but operationally, it does have a change. Because if you delete the primary, everything in the set goes away. And that's important. That's an important consideration to keep in mind. But the delete of an individual variant only impacts that variant itself. Doesn't impact anything but its own label. Next slide. These are the big things that change. It's important to recognize that the create command has a principal task to create a new normal domain. But to support variants, what we did is you need to just add an optional extension. If you're supporting variants, you include the extension and you explicitly identify the label as being the primary of a variant set. And it's important for the registrar to indicate to the registry that they know that this is what they're doing, so the registry can acknowledge that and then treat it in that proper way. This gets to this notion of what's called same entity principle in the policy requirements, which gets to the point that every label in a variant set must belong to the same entity, essentially the registrant or registered name holder. And that's a requirement in the process in general. So we just need an indication that the registrar knows what they're doing. The update command is where the real work is all done. And this is the command which changes, which has to do a lot of work on the back end, given that variants are in play. You include in the update, you update whichever label it is that you want to update. So if you don't create variant labels, you update a variant label. That's an important distinction to make. You only create the primary label. As you want to allocate variants, you use the update command to do that. And then what you have to do is indicate in the extension the primary label that goes with it. So that's just a way for the registrar and registry to communicate, the registrar asserting to the registry that it knows that it's actually a create of a variant label. And that's part of what's going on there in terms of a policy. So what's missing in the document overall is just all of the XML that goes with. This overall architecture has, as I said, kind of been socialized with a small group of implementers on the GTLD side. We've had quite a bit of discussion about it amongst a small group of us. But at this point, it's now ready for bringing forward here for discussion in the IETF group so that we can define an extension. And we'd like for it to be a standard. We could do this as an individual thing, but it seems more appropriate to make it a standard. And so we want to bring it to this working group and get it reviewed more broadly. And then, of course, all the XML will have to be carefully considered against a broader set of implementers. And the next slide, I think, is the last one, and that's just asking for questions and adoption. That's where we are going to be with this, and we'll be bringing that to the mailing list at large. Back to you.
Okay, thank you, Jim. We have quite a lot of people in the queue already, so I'm just closing the queue because we don't have much time left. But Andy, you were first, so go ahead.
Generally supportive of the work. I think it's actually, I think it's necessary. I do have a question. Does blocked mean no intent to allocate?
Yes.
Okay.
In
So,
IDN terms, that's what it means.
okay. So I don't know if operationally there's a difference. I'm just going to point that out. It was kind of confusing for me. So we may want to keep those terms in those two terms in the draft because that's what the policy people speak as well. But operationally, I don't think there's a difference.
Okay, thanks.
Scott, you next.
Scott Hollenbeck. And Jim, again, I apologize for not reading this draft. Does it include a description of the algorithm that the server operator must use to generate the variance when a create command is received?
No, and that wouldn't be in this document. That's part of the script table. So that's part of the label generation rules, and that's a separate process.
Okay, so is there a normative reference to that included in this draft?
No. Interesting question as to whether we should at least make reference to how that comes about.
Well, I think so,
But-
because you're saying that there are a whole bunch of rules here about what the server operator can and cannot do based on manipulating one member of the set. But if you don't tell me how to create the set, I don't know, what I can and cannot do when I'm implementing this.
Yeah, fair point. I don't see a problem with having at least an informational reference back to how you get your script tables and stuff. So that's a good point. Thanks.
Okay, Stefan.
Stefan Wink, SRDN. Sorry for not reading the draft, but I was wondering, does this have any implication on fees that are asked for the variants? As in, if I register foo.com and there are several variants, do I have to pay for those? And are you thinking about how this will affect that?
So this document, no, that would be completely out of scope, and it doesn't now. That's purely on the policy side, and so not included here at all.
Okay, thank you.
And James Gould.
Yeah, Jim Gold from VeriSign. Yeah, Andy, there is a operational impact for block because block would mean that variants cannot be registered. Our registries do not allow for registration of variants. I do have a concern around this whole primary notion. It adds a lot of complexity. I've thought this through very deeply. I believe it would be better as a set, allow them to be individually managed and be related, and pretty much allow, because where it gets down to is like when you're managing statuses, the status is on a per domain basis. So like what happens when one of the domain names are in server delete prohibited and you try to delete the primary? And also how many variants can you have registered? And it may be a scalability issue related to deleting a huge number in one transaction. So.
Yeah, thank you. You and I were having a discussion earlier today about some of this. We'll have to dig into all of that as we take this work forward and go on to it. Try to abstract that into what are the technical issues versus the policy issues. There's an important line to draw there, and I'm not prepared to speak to exactly what it is, but thank you for bringing up the question both today and previously. I'm sure we're going to dig into it as time goes on.
Hello, this is David Krishnic. I'm working from Colade. Just have a question actually on, it crosses a little bit into policy again. I'm sorry, but it is quite important. So when you make a domain part of a set and you have multiple labels that are kind of the same ownership, say one is subject to UDRP, but it's just one label. And if it is the primary, then you lose the whole set. If it's not the primary, then you're in a pickle because you need to move one domain out of a set. So who's really the owner of that domain, So will you also consider, well, at least, trying to make a mechanism for UDRPs to have an endpoint or perhaps a change of primary in the update command?
So that's an interesting technical discussion that we can have. I will tell you that driven from the policies on the GTLD side, that scenario can't happen because the policies don't allow for it. The UDRP requires that what part of what's told is recognizing this is part of a set. It also has to tell you about all the rest. And the same entity principle does not allow a variant to move without all the names. So, but in recognizing that that's a GTLD policy and not a CCTLD policy, we'll have to talk more about whether or not this current proposal supports that mechanism and supports those needs carefully. I don't know the answer off the top of my head because I haven't really thought about whether or not this would allow that carefully.
Just a second question though, the actual update of what is a primary label, is that considered in the draft, and should it be?
The
maybe?
policies on the GTLD side don't allow the you to update a primary in that way.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Last one, Edmund. Sorry, Zhang and Pavel, but we are running out of time.
Yeah, Edmund here. Just in response to that question, allowing the update of the primary, that it is allowed. I just want to make clear. Actually, you said so in your presentation earlier. The
Maybe I
update command,
misunderstood his question. I apologize.
yeah. So it is possible if a UDRP happens and let's say it goes to someone else and they want to update the primary, it should be possible. And I think you mentioned.
Yeah,
that
it would update all of them. Yeah.
Right. Update. Okay. So I have which is related to this as well. Earlier, Jim mentioned about not identifying the primary, and that's part of the reason why it has to be identified. Two things. One is in response to the UDRP situation, but also to calculate the allocatable variance, because different primaries could end up with different allocatable variants. So you have the entire set. Part of it is blocked, and part of it, the disposition is allocatable. And that goes back to, I think, Andy's earlier question. The statuses actually do have different meanings. So the blocked one means that a primary generates a set of variants, but certain portion of it is blocked and cannot be allocated or activated. And in general, I guess part of the right now the draft seems to be very early version. The statuses probably needs to be better defined and stuff. So I see that you sometimes use blocked and allocatable, allocated. I guess it's just the terminology that so that there is a difference between blocked and allocatable, and together they form the entire set. So and the last thing I want to mention is that in response to Scott, I think that this document should point to the LGR RCs, but not mandate it. So it can point to that as in one way of doing it is that because the policy actually allows, the policy actually points also to the LGR RC, but also allows registries to implement different types of tables, which VeriSign does, as I understand. And so I think we should point to it and say, this is the kind of thing that we're talking about, but not like, mandate it. So, yeah.
No, thank you. Very good clarification.
And I think we should adopt the document, of course.
Yeah, very good clarification on both points. And I apologize if I misunderstood your update question before, but perhaps we can clarify that later. So that's it. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. And we go to our last presentation. So sorry for people who are still in the queue, but we want to give Tom Harrison some time too. So Tom, please go ahead and the floor is yours.
Yeah, this shouldn't take long. Okay, thanks. Next slide. So the IR search draft went through working group last call recently, and it has a slightly unconventional approach to how it works with extension identifiers. So most extensions use one identifier, whereas this one uses 5. It relies on bare paths or bare path segments, so path segments that are just the extension identifier. And similarly for members and responses, it depends on those being just the extension identifier. And it also adds new paths under existing paths. In particular, there's this /domains basic search in the core RDAP document. And this document defines a relational search underneath that existing path. So there was some discussion on the list about whether all of this was strictly in compliance with the core RDAP documents. And I was discussing that with Mario, who's the shepherd for this, and he thought it would be a good idea to just recap on this briefly at the meeting, just in case there was more input to be got. Next slide. So the arguments for how this, or rather the arguments against how this draft works, the first one is that bare paths don't appear to be permitted per RFC 9082. So the requirement there appears to be that path segments are the extension identifier plus an underscore plus another string. The second argument is quite similar. It's that bare members in JSON are not recommended. So not quite as prescriptive, but still a pretty strong directive against their use. And that's in RFC 9083. And the third argument is that if you permit new paths under existing paths, then that can make processing confusing, possibly ambiguous, stuff like that. The discussion on the list on that point in particular, the wash-up was that in this particular case, it's not a problem, but it's easy to imagine scenarios where people maybe weren't aware of a particular extension or a way in which a specific path worked, and you could end up with ambiguity as a result. So the arguments for how the draft works, the main one is really that IP and ASN are core object types in RDAP. So making them work, making all the core object types work consistently will make things a bit less surprising and a bit more intuitive for people who are actually using RDAP. So if we have a search path like, for example, rs_IPs, then someone using RDAP might go, why is this different? That's defined, IPs are defined in the core document. Why isn't it just /IPs, given that there's /domains and /name servers and so on? And in particular, if we had a path like rs_IPs and we go to register reverse searches for that, then you end up with searchable resource type in reverse search of rs_IPs, but a related resource type of IP. And that's the sort of thing where people might go, oh, are these different object types? Are they the same underlying thing? And also, what has change control over this thing? Because in pretty much any other scenario where you had a path like that, the extension would control the underlying object. But that isn't the case here because IP is something that's covered by those core RDAP documents. Another consideration is that there are existing RFCs that use similar approaches. RFC 9536 is the reverse search document. So it defines a path under an existing path, and it also depends on bare path segments. And RFC 9537 is the redacted document, and it uses bare members in responses. And the final point is that bare paths, members, etc., are unlikely to actually cause many problems in practice. So even though they're not strictly in conformance with that text on the other part of the slide, the main reason for having extension identifiers is namespacing, making sure extensions don't clobber each other, and that sort of thing. And that we don't take anything away from that by relying on bare paths and bare members. And that's it. Does anybody have any comments?
Thank you, Tom. Anybody have any questions? James and Paul, I think you're still in the queue from the previous presentation. But James is, yeah, you added yourself back. Go ahead. Stay up. James still has a question.
Oh,
Yeah,
no,
okay.
No. Yeah, I mean, we actually discussed the whole bare path thing on the mailing list, and I really didn't consider it to be an issue. And looking at the RFC language, maybe we need to just make tighter RFC language related to format, because it would be great if there was A, B, and F in the base RFCs that made it perfectly clear exactly what was acceptable. Like the language of can be created by prefixing sounds not very normative to me. So it would be great going forward. We can't fix it right now, but I'm hoping in the extensions draft we'll be able to help address this. But I see no issue with bare extension identifiers because you just need it to be unique. That's the key. So.
Scott Hollenbeck. Tom or someone, could you flip back a slide or two to the one that actually lists, yeah, okay, here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 extension identifiers. Is this one extension?
It's one extension.
All right, but it's one extension, but we've got 5 different extension identifiers that you're proposing registration.
Yep.
See, and that's where I start to have a little bit of itchiness about what we're doing here, right? Because I think in the core RFCs use this notion of an extension being identified by one identifier. Right, and I get what you're saying about the fact that we've managed to produce 2 RFCs that do something a little bit different. In my mind, that's not justification for continuing the practice. However, I think some of the blame for that falls squarely on the shoulders of the designated experts. Flog those guys, please. Okay, but anyway, as Jim just said, before we approve this going forward, I really do think we need to address some of the questions that have been raised in the context of the extensions draft.
Yeah, sure. I think just on the identifiers quickly, I think that it's kind of similar to the bare paths and segments in that I can definitely see the argument for just having one per document, but I think there's a question about whether it actually will cause any problems in practice. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Tom. So that was the last presentation for today's session. We will have another session tomorrow with updates for all the existing documents still in our queue. And I will have a discussion with Jim tomorrow about adding some time there to look at our milestone list and to see all the presentations from today that have been requesting for adoption. And let's have that discussion tomorrow. And I'll give you 3 minutes back for your time. And the first time we're not late. Thank you all. Meeting adjourned.
Okay. As I said, I need to bail. I will. You want to do lunch tomorrow?
We could do that, yes.
Let's do.
I'm
going to go to DM's. I'll be around.
Okay. Then I'll probably see you there before DM's. I also have quite some questions about the variant.
Excellent. Excellent. Let's do it.
Yeah.
All right.
Good luck with your mentor.
Yes. Yes. Who I have not even seen.